You may have noticed that words sometimes appear in places that you wouldn't normally expect them to. Take a sentence like, I like apples. Notice that the apples can also come out front. Apples, I like. Now these two clauses mean the same thing. To be more precise, they're truth conditionally equivalent. That means there's no point at which one of them is true and the other isn't. You couldn't, if someone said, apples Bill likes, you couldn't respond, well, that's not true, Bill likes apples. The objection just wouldn't make sense. The objection would have to be, well, that's not true. Bill likes bananas, or Bill only likes some apples, or Alistair likes apples. But even though I like apples and apples I like mean the same thing, you don't have a free choice about which one you use. There are certain things that restrict where apples I like can appear. And that's because even though these sentences are saying the same thing, they say it in different ways. And these different ways of presenting information can make a difference in how the processing of the sentence happens, and it can make a difference in how the sentence hooks up to discourse that came before and the discourse that'll come next. So we won't look at information structure, and we'll only briefly consider constituent weight. We'll be concentrating instead on what the constructions look like. It might be a little frustrating because you'll see examples of sentences that look good or bad and you might wonder why, but we'll have to leave the explanation of that aside for now. Instead, consider this a quick flight over a number of different constructions that we'll get familiar with, and then once we have the tools of hearer status, discourse status, focus, and open propositions, we can come back to these constructions and find out exactly what's going on with them. There are several ways to divide up these constructions. We can talk about those constructions that have a placeholder where the phrase would normally occur, and those that don't have any such placeholder. When there is a placeholder, sometimes it's referential, so it points to something in particular, and other times it's non-referential, so it really only functions as a placeholder. I'll start with the constructions that leave a referential placeholder there, and these are called left and right dislocation. So we'll start with the sentence, I like those apples you bought me. Left dislocation on those apples you bought me would produce, those apples you bought me, I like them. Right dislocation would shift things the other way. I like them, those apples you bought me. Left and right dislocation can apply to noun phrases in a wide variety of functions. Subjects work. Mr. Kurtz is dead can become Mr. Kurtz, he's dead. Objects of prepositions work too. I gave the apple to your sister can become I gave the apple to her, your sister. Subject determiners within larger MPs can also work. So I can say, those friends of yours you introduced me to, I went to go see their play. Notice that there's a clear simplification going on in that last sentence. Genitive phrases can be pretty awkward at times. It can be pretty awkward to say, I went to go see those friends of yours you introduced me to's play. But you'll get dislocation happening even when there isn't that simplification going on. So that's what left and right dislocation look like. Let's look at what happens when the placeholder that's left behind isn't referential. Instead, they use an expletive word like it or there where we'd normally expect to find the phrase in question. When I say expletive, I'm excluding certain readings of it or there. It can be a normal referential pronoun, as in it is funny, it referring to a play or a joke or a book. But if you say, it's funny that you said that, it doesn't refer to the thing that you said. After all, the thing that you said might be very serious and not funny at all. It's that you said it that's funny. Similarly, I'm not talking about the there as in over there. There is the bus can mean pretty much the same thing as the bus is in that location, but there's also the sentence, there's the bus, which is reminding you of the option of the bus without really referring to its location at all. For instance, let's imagine we're talking about how to get to the city. One person says, oh, I can't drive because my car's in the shop and the train's too expensive. And the other person might say, well, there's the bus. That second person is presenting the bus as an option without referring to a certain bus in a certain location. The first two constructions with expletives that we'll look at are the existential and the presentational, and they both use there. Take a sentence like, a man is on stage. I could replace the former subject, a man, with the expletive pronoun there, and then the original subject would then appear as the complement of the verb be. This would give you, there is a man on stage. Several things can follow the subject. There we had a locative extension, but we could also have one referring to time. A conference is after lunch becomes, there's a conference after lunch. Predicative adjectives can also be found, but the selection is quite restricted. Several options are available to us becomes, there are several options available to us. But you couldn't, for instance, take blue as in some flowers are blue. You couldn't create an existential out of that. You couldn't say there are some flowers blue. Infinitivals with gaps also work. So I could say there are some options to consider. And existentials can also appear without anything following them. These are called bare existentials. So I could just say there are some options. Now if you look at these, you might notice that, well, they don't really have a corresponding basic form. You can't say some options are. The same is true of infinitivals. Some options are to consider is simply not something that people say. For that matter, you can find even NPs that just don't work. Well, I can say there's a hole in this apple. I can't say a hole is in this apple. So these are our first examples of clauses that really only appear in the more complex form, not in the simpler one. By the way, notice that B agrees with the display subject. So if I have one mouse in the wall, I could say there is a mouse in the wall. If I have more than one mouse, I could say, well, there are mice in the wall. Incidentally, if you're like me, when the verb be is reduced, you actually don't need to agree with that display subject. So I could easily see myself saying, there's mice in the wall. At the same time, I would only say there are mice in the wall. I wouldn't say there is mice in the wall. But once that be gets reduced to z, I have no problem with a lack of agreement. Presentationals are very similar to existentials, but they have slightly different properties. They involve the use of one of a limited number of verbs other than be, usually referring to existing or appearing. As these verbs can appear without complements, the verb presentationals do have a more basic form that works. So several reasons exist becomes there exist several reasons. We still run into problems in other situations like the infinitivals that we were talking about. We can have there remain several tasks to complete, but we can't have several tasks remain to complete. Next come it clefs. The reason why we use the word cleft is because these sentences are split into two, into foregrounded and backgrounded portions. Take a sentence like, Albert gave the apple to Bobby. We can foreground Albert, the apple, or Bobby, creating three separate it clefs. The backgrounded information is presupposed, which means that we assume that it's true. The it cleft starts with the expletive it, and then comes the verb be appropriately inflected, and then comes the foregrounded element. Finally, the backgrounded information becomes part of an integrated relative clause that attaches as a dependent. Notice that if we make these three it clefs negative, the presupposition in each case is preserved. So somebody gave the apple to Bobby, Albert gave something to Bobby, and Albert gave the apple to somebody, respectively. These are all true, regardless of whether the main clause is negative. We're not restricted to foregrounding MPs. We can also foreground PPs. So Bobby ate the apple in his room. If we foreground in his room, we can say it was in his room that Bobby ate the apple. Finally, we have extraposition. Here, a subject or a complement is relocated later on in the phrase, and expletive it is found as a placeholder. So instead of that you found it surprised me, it would be it surprised me that you found it. Now the first clause is syntactically more basic. There are fewer words, and the subordinate clause that functions as subject is found before the verb, where we expect it to be. But I think you'll agree with me that the second one sounds more natural. Something odd is happening here. The basic version is the one with the constraints on it. Again, we'll get to these constraints a little bit later. For now, let's move on. I do want to mention that the other factor at work here is constituent weight. If I say that our planet, like all the others, revolves around the sun, is obvious, well, I've loaded a lot of information up front. This makes it a bit difficult to process. You have to wait till the end of the sentence to figure out what it's all about. It's not unacceptable, but it's clearly easier to process a sentence like, it's obvious that our planet, like all the others, revolves around the sun. Note that extraposition of complements is even more likely. So you rarely hear people say things like, I found that you didn't show up to the test surprising. Instead, you'd find people say, I found it surprising that you didn't show up to the test. Now, extraposition looks pretty similar to right dislocation, so you might wonder what the difference is. Well, first, you can hear the difference. There's a pause in right dislocation that's represented in written text by a comma that's just not present in the extraposition. So extraposition sounds like, it's great that you came, not, it's great that you came. Right dislocation sounds like, it's great, that sweater, not, it's great, that sweater. But it's even more important to remember that right dislocation involves a referential pronoun. So the it in it's great, that sweater refers to the same thing that the sweater refers to. On the other hand, the it in it's great that you came doesn't refer to anything, it's just a placeholder. It's the expletive. Also, Right dislocation almost exclusively involves NPs, whereas extraposition almost exclusively involves clauses, subordinate clauses. There are some exceptions to this, but if you're interested, please check out the Cambridge Grammar on page 1414. Finally, we have those constructions where the element does not leave a placeholder. Our very first example, preposing, was just that. So remember, I like apples became apples I like. It's quite common for parts of a clause to appear at the beginning. For parts that aren't lexically governed by the verb like an adjunct, it's quite easy for this to happen. I'm sure you can imagine a conversation opening with the sentence, "In my living room, I ate an apple." But lexically governed PPs don't make the change so easily. So, "On the table, I put an apple" is an odd way to begin a conversation. It works as a sentence, but not in discourse initial position. On the table is selected by the verb put, whereas in my living room can work with pretty much any verb. You can test this by substituting a semantically bleached alternative. I did something in my living room is a good replacement for I ate an apple in my living room, but I did something on the table doesn't replace the verb in I put something on the table. With I did something on the table, it sounds like I actually got up on the table and did something there, which is not what's expressed by I put something on the table. So we've seen that NPs and PPs can be proposed. The same is true of adjective phrases and verb phrases. They might sound a little odd in isolation, so listen to music I have. Expensive they are not. In fact, these constructions as I've used them right now sound like they might have come from the lips of Yoda from Star Wars. And the reason that Yoda sounds odd when he uses these constructions is because he uses them in situations where native speakers of English would not. With the right context, there's actually no problem. So I could say, I came to town to listen to music, and listen to music I have. Or, I'd like to introduce you to our new line of apples. Wonderfully delicious and crunchy they are, but expensive they are not. You can see that they sound natural in these situations. So that's preposing. Postposing involves something coming later than you'd normally expect it to. Let's look at an example. I ate the apple with great pleasure. With great pleasure is an adjunct, and so it comes after the object, the apple. I ate with great pleasure the apple sounds stilted at best. But if I expand the NP, the apple, with additional words, suddenly it starts to sound like it'd be better at the end. I ate the apple that you bought for me the other day when we went shopping together with great pleasure. Now there's also attachment ambiguity going on there. We don't know whether we went shopping with pleasure or whether I ate it with pleasure, but that's not really the point. The point is that this large phrase becomes very awkward there, and it sounds much more natural if it comes at the end. The processing is made easier. Let's let heavy NP shift put that object at the end. I ate with great pleasure the apple you bought me the other day when we went shopping together. And this brings us to the construction where the constituents are both prepose and postpose, and this makes it look like the sentence has been turned right around. We'll start with inversion and then we'll go to passives. In a limited subset of sentences, what's normally the complement or sometimes the adjunct of the verb appears before it, and what's normally the subject appears after. So an apple is in my hand becomes in my hand is an apple. That's a PP. I could also have an adjective phrase. This next apple is equally shiny becomes equally shiny as this next apple. But we're limited to verbs like be, sits, and so on. What the passive does is it opens up this switch around to an even wider array of situations. So you couldn't take the sentence, the dog ate the apple, and switch it around to the apple ate the dog. You get a different meaning. But you could say the apple was eaten by the dog. This is a paradigmatic passive clause. The object Bob is placed in the subject position. There's a verb be that takes on the appropriate inflection. And the original verb, which no longer carries inflection, takes the form of the past participle. The original subject appears in a complement, a PP, that begins with by. Of course, this complement is optional. We can have bare passives which don't include it, just this apple was eaten. We're not forced to include the former subject in the new sentence. Now, when I said the object gets put up front, I don't necessarily mean the direct object. With ditransitives, the indirect object is what's promoted to the subject position. I gave Bob the apple becomes Bob was given the apple. And it isn't necessarily an object of the verb that gets promoted. The object of a preposition can also be promoted to the subject. Bob sat on my apple can become My apple was sat on, optionally by Bob. Notice that be can often be replaced by get, provided that the situation is either of benefit or of harm to someone, and that the new subject somehow bears some responsibility or was responsible for bringing about the situation. So I can say, I got promoted or I got fired because those things would be good or bad for me. I could say I got seen by a nurse because that would be good for me if I were sick. But I can't say the tree got seen because the tree doesn't really care too much about it, and the tree didn't do anything to bring about the seeing. It's not obvious how it would harm or benefit the tree. Also, we often see passives that don't contain the auxiliary verb. These generally occur as adjuncts or embedded within larger clauses. So, I had the apple sliced into pieces. Or, the apple sliced into pieces, my job was done. Or, sliced into pieces, apples quickly turn brown. These are harder to identify because we're missing some of the clues that show us that these are passive clauses, but passive clauses they are nonetheless. Now, we've entirely ignored the issue of why we would want to use a passive clause, or indeed any of these constructions. But we do know what these constructions look like now, and it's important to know what we're talking about before we start talking about why things are the way they are. So let's have a quick review, moving backwards. Preposing puts things earlier in the clause without leaving any placeholder. So, I like apples becomes apples I like. That's preposing. Postposing puts things later, again without any placeholder. So, I ate the apple you sent me with great enjoyment becomes I ate with great enjoyment the apple you sent me. And things can switch places with different parts in new spots. So, an apple was on the table can become on the table was an apple. That's inversion. My dog ate the apple can become the apple was eaten by my dog. That's the passive. Sometimes we use meaningless non-referential pronouns like it and there as placeholders. That you bought those apples pleased me can become it pleased me that you bought those apples. That's extraposition. The apple was great can become it was the apple that was great. That's an it cleft. An apple is on the table becomes there's an apple on the table. That's an existential. Several reasons for that exist becomes there exist several reasons for that. That's the presentational. Sometimes we use a referential pronoun like he, she, they, or it as a placeholder. That apple you gave me sure tasted good becomes that apple you gave me, it sure tasted good. That's left dislocation. Those apples you gave me are still on the table becomes they're still on the table, those apples you gave me. That's right dislocation. As a preview of what's to come, a few basic principles are at work here. Generally, older information comes before newer information. Brief phrases come before long ones. This makes sense. When you have something new and extended to say, it's nice to be able to attach it to existing knowledge or discourse. But these are just generalizations, and there are a lot of intricate details. We'll see that each individual construction has unique characteristics, and there are some characteristics that hold across families of these constructions. The study of how we switch around bits of clauses and why is called information packaging, and that's what this series of videos is going to be about. They're based on the information in A Student's Introduction to English Grammar by Rodney Huddleston and Jeffrey K. Pullum, and The Cambridge Grammar of the English Language by the same authors. I also use information status in non-canonical word order by Betty J. Berner and Gregory Ward. These two were also the co-authors of the chapter on information packaging in the Cambridge Grammar. Berner did her dissertation, The Discourse Function of Inversion in English, under Gregory Ward, who did his dissertation in turn. His dissertation was The Semantics and Pragmatics of Preposing. That was under Ellen Prince, who originated a lot of the ideas about here old versus here new, discourse old versus discourse new in an article called the ZPG letter. A great deal of the content of the upcoming lectures originates in the work of these three scholars, so if you find these constructions as interesting as I do, I highly suggest that you take a look at some of the work that they've done. Thank you.